Hi Bera, I'm here to read you chapter 7 of Kid Normal. Chapter 7 is called A School for Heroes. As the day wore on, it became clear to Murph that the story of his dramatic announcement in the CT lesson had spread through the school like wildfire. People were passing it on faster than a bout of nits. And yet, despite this newfound fame, Murph felt very alone. This should have been a pretty normal feeling for him. At his last school, he'd spent a lot of time on his own, and after a while, the other kids had more or less left him to it. But being alone at the school was an entirely new experience, because here nobody would stop staring at him. Even in a school full of weirdos who can inflate their own heads, I'm the outcast, he thought to himself glumly. He didn't even feel like he could call on his new pal Mary, because for all he knew, she might want to distance herself too, now he'd revealed he wasn't a skimmer like her. A couple of times he'd seen her walking his way with a determined expression, but he was so embarrassed that he'd kept his head down and managed to avoid her. Murph's presence at the school seemed to be a constant topic of conversation, and during the day, whether between lessons, at break time, lunchtime, any time really, there was a constant side-eyeing and whispering. He pretended it wasn't about him and tried to ignore it, but that was easier said than done, particularly when some people decided to confront him directly during an otherwise uneventful maths class. "How did you even end up here, Kid Normal?" asked TV Exploder Timothy aggressively. Murph shook his head, wishing he had a decent answer. He couldn't face embarrassing himself even more by telling the lame truth again. After maths, the class shuffled along to their next lesson, everybody avoiding Murph as if he had 3 heads, all of which had chicken pox. But before they could reach the next classroom, the axe that had been hovering over Murph's head for the last hour fell. "Who's Cooper?" a voice shouted. Murph looked up. 2 much older students were coming down the corridor towards him. Now what, he thought. They were impressive-looking creatures, a boy and a girl. The boy was handsome, dressed in a smart blazer. The girl was wearing sunglasses and had long, straight black hair. Murph noticed she was fiddling with some sort of phone with a green light on it, but she put it away as she approached the class. "Cooper?" she repeated. "Which one's Cooper?" That's the boy and the girl there. And obviously by Cooper they mean Murph, because his surname's Cooper. There was no need for him to answer. Everyone else had retreated, leaving him on his own in the middle of the corridor like a sad island. "Come on," said the wavy-haired boy. "Head's office." He gestured over his shoulder with a thumb and marched off. The others, who were watching from a distance, started mumbling as Murph was ushered away. "Do you think he's for it?" someone whispered. "Back to normal school for Kid Normal," said another voice as he turned the corner. "What's going to happen to him?" someone else asked. The whole class was quietly simmering with nosy excitement and speculation as he trudged off. This is it, thought Murph as he shuffled down the corridor. At least he could claim the world record for shortest stay ever at a weird school for weirdos. He suddenly felt frustrated he would never get to know more. He was bewildered by it all, for sure, but this school was the most interesting place he'd been in ages. And much like you do before leaving for the airport at the end of a holiday, he took one last fond look at his surroundings before they were just a surreal memory. They headed past classrooms where the next lessons were just beginning. He could hear teachers' voices, and as he passed one room there was a loud bang and a gasp from his soon-to-be ex-schoolmates. The old caretaker hurried down the corridor with a fire extinguisher and looked at Murph quizzically. Murph noticed the name Carl written on the white embroidered badge on his blue overalls. "Just in case," Carl shouted over his shoulder, barging through the classroom door with the extinguisher at the ready. Presently, Murph's 2 companions stopped to give him his final directions. "Straight down the main corridor to the end and up the stairs. It's the round bit that looks out over the playing field. You know it." Murph had indeed noticed a turret-like structure tacked onto the edge of what were otherwise pretty conventional-looking school buildings, and he began climbing cheerlessly onto the top of it. Slightly out of breath, Murph arrived outside Mr. Superman's study. He found himself in a small, cluttered waiting area lined with bookcases. The tops of these bookcases held a selection of rather strange ornaments. There were a few carved wooden animals, but Murph also noticed what looked like a shark's jawbone and a black metal dial that could have come from an old-fashioned aeroplane. A yellowing poster showing a snowy mountain top was tacked to the wall beside a black and white photograph of a large waterfall. It was as though he'd wandered into a junk shop by mistake, but he didn't say that to the old lady who was sitting at a desk in the middle of all the clutter. It would have been rude. Instead, he gave the international noise for "please stop tapping at your laptop and look at me," which sounds exactly like a small, nervous cough. The lady stopped tapping at her laptop and looked up at him. She had fluffy white hair that made her head look like someone had smeared it with glue and rolled it in cotton wool, but you shouldn't do that to old ladies because it's cruel. Her eyes, set inside deltas of wrinkles, were very bright and seemed kind. This is her. she said to Murph simply. "Hello," replied Murph. "I'm here to see, Mr. Superman. He won't be a minute. It's Murph, isn't it?" He nodded. "Have a seat for a bit, why don't you?" Murph looked round and saw a row of hard plastic stools in front of one of the bookcases. Once he was uncomfortably sat down, an uncomfortable silence grew just to add to the general air of uncomfort. The lady with white hair, whose name was Flora, by the way, although she hasn't told us that yet, didn't go back to her typing. Instead, she gazed at Murph intently as he balanced on his plastic perch like the world's unluckiest gnome. "Well, you're a turn-up for the books, aren't you?" she said after a moment. Murph only raised his eyebrows in reply. "How did you manage to end up here, I wonder?" she went on absently, almost to herself. She smiled at him and her kind face crinkled up like a friendly crumpled crisp packet, and suddenly Murph was telling her everything. His mum's job, the friends he missed, the awful new house, it all came spilling out. As he spoke, he realised that he'd wanted to say a lot of this out loud to his mum for a long time, but he'd been keeping it bottled, as he knew she felt guilty enough as it was. But now he just couldn't help himself. This nice grandma-ish lady had appeared, and he let rip. "And now they've found out I don't have one of these dumb capabilities, I suppose they're going to throw me out," he finished. For a nightmare moment, Murph thought he might be about to cry, but he'd become an expert at cutting that feeling off and pulled himself together just in time. The white-haired lady smiled at him again. "Well, you're quite the worrier, aren't you? But it always helps to have a chat about it, I find." She inclined her head respectfully. "Picking the right people to share your worries with, that's the important bit. These things have a way of coming out in the wash anyway," she went on, which is the sort of thing that older ladies often say. In fact, it was a favourite saying of Murph's grandma, though he hardly ever got to hear her say it because they'd had to move so far away. "My name's Flora, by the way," confirmed Flora. "You'll usually find me here outside the head's office, so if you feel it's all getting on top of you, you come and let me know, all right? I'm here to listen if you need me. I'll go and see if he's ready." Flora gave him a reassuring wink and disappeared through the head teacher's office door. Even though he was still convinced he was about to be told to find a new school, Murph had started to feel about 2% better, which was a significant improvement on the last few weeks and took him to a grand total of 5%. But it had been good to talk to someone about it all, he realised. He sighed and prepared himself as Flora came back out the office and gestured to him encouragingly. When he stepped inside, Flora nodded kindly, shuffled out and closed the door behind her. "Ah, yes, Mr. Cooper, come in," said the head teacher, ushering Murph over to his desk and striding across to a window, which he decided to stare out of in order to appear more impressive. Murph just thought he was being odd, and as he didn't have a face to look at, his gaze wandered around the room, taking in his surroundings. The office was round, with large picture windows on all sides overlooking the fields at the back of the school, and the patch of woodland behind them. In between the windows was a series of framed pictures of a much younger Mr. Superman in a tight-fitting red costume. One showed him shaking hands with a lady with puffy hair and a smart blue suit outside a black door with a number 10 on it. In another, he was holding a small kitten and looking very pleased with himself. A third showed him with his hands on his hips, one foot planted on what appeared to be a gigantic unconscious clown. A collapsed and scorched circus tent smouldered in the background. Mr. Superman spun round and saw Murph staring. "Party animal," he called himself. Catchphrase, "It's my party and you'll die if I want to." Nasty piece of work. "Do have a seat." Murph sank into one of the 3 comfortable leather chairs that were arranged in front of the large wooden desk. The desk was bare except for a phone that looked very much like the one the girl with sunglasses had been using, but it wasn't a model Murph recognised. Mr. Superman turned away from him again and gazed out over the grounds. "I expect this all seems a little strange to you, Mr. Cooper." Murph nodded, thinking privately that the word strange didn't even begin to cover it. "You and your charming mother have stumbled across a school that is not for ordinary children." This is it, thought Murph. This is where they call Mum and get her to pick me up when we start Operation School Search all over again. "But after much deliberation, I have decided that I will allow you to stay with us for the time being. After all, a touch of outside perspective might help our little community," blustered Mr. Superman. Murph had no idea what was going on, but he kept his mouth shut, which was a tactic that had often served him well. At this point, Mr. Superman turned back round once more to face him. His arms underneath his grey jacket seemed to be bulging more than usual. It looked as if his biceps might make a bid for freedom at any moment. "I just need to know," he said, fixing Murph with a steely gaze, "that we can count on your discretion." Based on the earlier flying episode, which got him into this sticky toffee pudding of a problem to begin with, Murph thought it would be best to ask for clarity. "When you say discretion, what exactly are we talking about?" Mr. Superman picked up a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the windowsill and drained it. It had gone cold and tasted disgusting, but he hid it well. I mean, Murph continued, do you mean that if I accidentally let slip a couple of things about what goes on at this school to my mum, you'll be slightly miffed? Not quite, Mr. Cooper, replied Mr. Superman with a raise of an eyebrow and a ripple of an arm. Or is it more like, don't under any circumstances breathe a word to anyone about the secret school or you'll be killed, suggested Murph. Ha! Replied Mr. Superman, banging a hand on his desk and denting it. The smile suddenly vanished from his face. Yes, the latter. He seemed to relent slightly. Well, probably not killed, he added kindly, but certainly, well, as I say, I'm sure we can count on your discretion. There was a silence as if they'd both forgotten their lines in a rubbish school play. Murph volunteered the start of one. He was cut off immediately. It wasn't his turn to speak. Cooper, it's perfectly simple. Do not tell anyone outside of the school about the school, do you understand? There was a crunching noise as Mr. Superman absent-mindedly crushed his coffee cup into a fine powder with one hand before pouring the remains into the bin. Murph thought he got the message. Hope you enjoyed. See you in a couple of days for the next chapter.